So, what does it mean to read culture? Well, we could perhaps mean to refer to a culture of reading. But in this particular instance, that is not what I'm referring to. I'm speaking of a reading culture. I am talking about reading culture itself. As I mentioned in my introduction, you can read culture in a way like you can read a book. So, in that sense, we're talking about the act of reading culture. Now, if we can read culture by reading literature, then the next step is to, before we move on to a more specific cultural manifestation that we will be reading in literature, in specific texts, it's worth thinking about what we mean when we say culture. So, in modern usage, culture generally refers to things like entertainment, right? Movies, music, also things like clothes or artistic works, things like that. But it might be worth considering the origins of the word culture itself. Culture, at least in part, derives from the Latin word cultura. And cultura is where we get the words for cultivation. In other words, it had to do with the tilling, the maintenance, right? The cultivating of the soil, of the land, of plants, herbs, that which produces food, grain, wheat, even fruits, right? This is what cultura meant in Latin. And hence we get the words agriculture, horticulture. But it also is where we get the word cult. And cult not just in the more modern pejorative sense, but also in the more traditionally Christian sense of the cult of the saints, right? A cultivation of some kind of pious or religious activity. Now, these two things are related, and indeed, it's also related to other forms of the word. The idea that you can cultivate your mind, you can cultivate your body, and so we eventually get to more modern use of the word culture. Now, it is important to think about perhaps the difference between this more historical understanding of the word culture and the way it is often used today. Indeed, in modern use, it seems to not always be clear what the difference is between culture and entertainment. Well, one of the things that might be worth thinking about is culture as a manifestation of society, of civilization. In other words, in some way, it's participative, right? The way that you participate in agriculture, you participate in religion. And so, in that way, it might be worth thinking about how, in this context, even though we're going to be focusing, of course, on literature, after all, we're going to be reading culture by reading texts, I mean, quite literally. However, it might be worth thinking about these origins of the word, right? This word that comes out of an ancient past of religious expression and earthly tillage, and think about how, perhaps, this informs what we mean when we talk about culture generally, and particularly how we cultivate it. After all, what we plant in the soil and how we cultivate it affects what we reap. What we plant in culture, say through literature, may very well affect what we reap.